going on, guys? So today we're going to be placing the rear brakes and we're going to show you guys how to replace the pads and the rotors. So for hardware, today we got a set of UUC rear rotors and some WBR ceramic pads that are going to be going on the car. We also have a brand new pad wear sensor that we're also going to be installing. And our pad wear sensor is on the right rear. Tools we will be using: 3/8 driver, 7mm Allen key bit for the 3/8 drive. That could also be replaced with a 7mm Allen key if you don't have a 3/8 bit. A 1/2" driver or a 1/2" impact, and a 17mm socket. That is for removing the lugs to get the wheel off. A flathead screwdriver to help remove the spring retaining clip that holds the brake caliper onto the brake caliper housing. A 1/2" torque wrench and a 1/2" extension that is for torquing the lug nuts when you put the wheel back on. And some multi-purpose grease for lubing the sliding pins and the back of the brake pads. This is all you will need to replace the pads themselves. If you want to replace the rotors, you'll also need a 6mm Allen key bit for taking the Allen bolt off that holds the rotor onto the wheel bearing. A 16mm socket for removing the housing bolts, and a hammer to influence the rotor to get it off. They tend to be a little bit rusted on and often can stick. We didn't really have any issues with taking our rotor off. It slid off pretty easily, but in the case that the rotor is stuck on, a hammer is a great way to help that rotor come off. It's also nice to have some brake clean and some paper towels just to clean things up and get it looking good. Some rotors tend to have an oil film on them to prevent the rotor from rusting. Some tools that you will need that are not here include a jack and jack stands to get the car up off the ground, and a wheel chock to chock the front wheels if you're on a hill or anything like that, just to prevent the car from rolling away on you. So the first step is to get the car in the air and jack it up. I'm not going to go into too much detail about how to jack these cars up. I will leave a video link in the description for you guys if you want to know how to jack up the car. So for this instance, we're going to be replacing the rotors, and the parking brake actually holds on the inside of the rotor, so we're going to have to take that off to be able to pull off the rotor. And you're going to want to take off the brake master reservoir, top of it, just to let some air out as we push the piston back into the caliper. Next thing we're going to have to do is remove the wheel to get access to the brakes and brake caliper. The lugs are 17mm. So on the back of the brake caliper we have these little dust boots right here, and these guys are going to pop off and come right out. And there's one up top and there's one on the bottom back here. So once you remove those dust boots, there are little 7mm Allen key bolts that hold the caliper into place. You're going to want to remove those with a 7mm Allen key bit. Something like this. You can use a 7mm Allen wrench, but you get a lot more leverage using a bit with a 3/8 driver on it. Be sure to remove the upper and the lower one. Once those are out, we got to take off this little spring clip here. If you pull back on it and pull it out, you can usually get it out. There we go. Screwdriver for leverage. Alright, from there the caliper basically just slides back and off. You might have to use some force on it. There we go. So our pad wear sensor was already out of the pad. If it's in, it'll be sitting sort of in on the pad like this. If you just take the wire and just pull it back out, it should pop out fairly easily. Alright, so now from here, if you're going to be just replacing the pads, you would compress the piston with a C-clamp, slap new pads on it, and put it all back together. But since we're replacing the rotors, we're going to have to pull the caliper housing off and pull the rotor off. It means we're going to have to secure the caliper to keep it from hanging on the brake line, because that's really bad for it. Alright, so since the rear brake caliper lines are so short, we couldn't really move it around to zip tie it to anything, so we just put the jack underneath there, and we have it just sort of resting on the jack. So the idea is not to let the caliper hang by its brake line, because that's really bad for it, and it can crack it and cause all sorts of problems. Alright, so to get this caliper housing off, there are two bolts. There's 16mm, one is right there, and the other is directly below it. And you just zip those guys off, and then the caliper housing comes right off. There we go, and the caliper slides right off. Now from here, to get the rotor off, they have this little Allen key right there. That guy is a 6mm, and he just unscrews. Now this is the important part about having the parking brake off, because For those of you who don't know, the parking brake assembly is actually drum shoes inside of here that bow out. And if you have the parking brake on, it's going to sandwich it and hold the rotor in place. So not only are you going to be fighting rust to get the rotor off, you're also going to be fighting the parking brake to get the rotor off. So those are your parking brake shoes. So it's actually a drum brake setup. Now these don't really wear at all. They'll last the lifetime of the car unless your e-brakes skidding your car, in which case you can wear them out pretty quickly. But these typically don't need to be replaced just because they don't really see that much abuse. Alright, to remove the brake wear sensor, you're going to want to trace the wire. Now it's kind of hard to get on camera because it's kind of tucked back there by the differential, but this little box right here is where the sensor clips in. So you're going to want to get a flathead and pop that little fuse box open. So you're going to want to pop the little box out, have that little connector. That little connector just pops out like that. You just unplug it. Then you're going to want to run your sensor out. Then you're going to want to reconnect the new sensor back in its little spot on the box. Alright, so quick reference. Here's the CV boot for the drive axle. The fuse box is directly above it. That's the little fuse box right there. Pop this little guy open, pull the connector out, unplug the connector, feed the guy through. There's a little clip right here that the wire sets into to hold it in place. That guy comes out, the new sensor comes in, clip the wire in there, plug it in, put it back in its spot, close the box, good to go. So often a new set of rotors will come with anti-rust treatment on it. They'll put a little film of oil on it. So you're going to want to clean that off with some brake clean. Give it a good once over to get all of that stuff off, just to make sure the rotors are all nice and clean. Alright, so if you're having trouble getting your new rotors on, it might be because your parking brake's adjusted out a little bit too much. So there's a little star wheel right here, and this guy actually rotates. So we're going to turn him in a few clicks just to set the shoes back a little bit. There we go. Alright, and now the new rotors go back on. Be sure to orient them properly and get that little bolt hole lined up for that Allen key. Now we're going to put our caliper housing back on, and those guys go back on with the two 16mm bolts that we took them off with. And make sure to get them nice and snug. Alright, so from here we're going to need to compress the rear caliper. So I'm going to take an old brake pad and stick it right over the piston there. And I'm going to fit my C-clamp right over it, hanging on the back, and I'm slowly going to walk the piston back in. There we go. That's all the way. Take our pad out. Alright, so now the piston's compressed. Now I like to take these little sliding pins out, and I'm going to put some brake lube on them just to get them all nice and lubricated, so when the caliper moves they'll have something to roll on and not just straight metal on metal. Alright, so I'm going to take a little bit of multi-purpose grease and I'm just going to rub around the pin. Get those guys all nice and wet. And then we're going to put those guys right back in their little spot. There we go. Alright, so we got the inner pad and the outer pad. The inner pad has these little fingers that stick up. So we're going to take a little bit of grease and we're going to coat the back of this pad with that. Now if you don't, these guys will like to squeak. And then we're going to pop that pad in with the fingers going inside the piston. There we go. And I got a little bit of grease on the pad, so I'm going to clean that off with some brake cleaner. From here, our other pad is going to just simply slide onto the caliper housing like that, and we're going to throw a little bit of lube on the back of him too. From there, you're basically just going to put the caliper back on the caliper housing with the new pads in it. From there, you're going to want to run those little sliding pins in with their 7mm Allen key. Make sure to get the upper and lower and get them nice and tight. Once those are done, remember to plug in those little dust boot caps that you pulled out. And from here, we're going to plug in the new brake wear sensor. So that guy sits in that little rivet on the brake pad. So we're going to plug him right in that little spot on the backing plate. And last but not least, we're going to reinstall our little retaining spring clip. Make sure the ears of that guy are pushed in and hug it on the caliper housing. And that's it, the brakes are together. From here, you're just going to want to put the tire back on, drop it to the ground, and torque it to 89 foot-pounds. Remember to close your master cylinder when you're done. And remember to pump the brakes until the pedal gets really firm to get the pistons back into adjustment. and pull the parking brake up and down to get it back into adjustment. Alright, that is it. Our brakes are done. The driver's side is exactly the same as the passenger side, just you don't have to deal with the wear sensor. Huge shout out to my boy Zain for letting me wrench on his car. Without him, these brake DIYs would not be possible.
Thank you guys so much for watching. Keep it fresh, and I'll see you guys later.
Maybe you should take it slow.